Okay, it is around 6:30, so I think we'll get started, and it's totally fine if other people join as we go tonight. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for joining tonight. It is exciting to see so many faces from so many different places across the state. Um, the program tonight will last for about an hour, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end of tonight's program. Let's start. Okay, so a few housekeeping notes before we get started. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there's a panel of different options. We ask that you stay muted throughout the presentation, and you can tell that option is off based on this icon on the far left, and you just want to make sure that there's a slash through it, which will help this dissuade any background noise and make sure that everyone can hear the presentation really well tonight. We also just want to note that we advise to keep your video off as well tonight. We are recording this presentation, and sometimes keeping your video off can actually help with some of the bandwidth. So if you're experiencing any kind of glitches or technical difficulties in seeing what's being shown tonight, sometimes turning off your video will really help with that and preserve your bandwidth. As you've been using already tonight, we have the chat. This is in the middle of the screen. I invite you to put any answers to questions that we asked throughout the presentation tonight, or any questions or technical difficulties that you might have. Please feel free to throw those in the chat. And then if you have any questions, such as what is the best bird food to provide to the birds at your feeder, you can throw those questions into our Q&A. As you look at this tool, you'll see that there are options to upvote questions that have been asked. So say someone's already asked a question that you really wanted answered tonight, you can throw that in the Q&A, or you can upvote someone's question that's already been asked. And Zoe is going to be managing both the chat and the Q&A tonight. And I recognize that there are a lot of new faces on this call tonight. So I also just wanted to give a quick introduction to New Hampshire Audubon and what we're all about as an organization in general. And then we'll dive in a little bit deeper to the Backyard Winter Bird Survey specifically. So for those of you who might not know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that is actually completely independent of the National Audubon. Our mission is to protect New Hampshire's natural environment for wildlife and for people, which we strive to do through 4 different program pillars. The first one is stewardship. We manage about 10,000 acres on 40 wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state. Our second pillar is education. We put a high value on connecting people to nature through school programs, nature day camps, and informal experiences. And then our third pillar is conservation, among which I am a part of. We research and conserve species in peril, and we keep track of how New Hampshire's wildlife species are doing. And then our fourth pillar is policy, where we advocate for sound environmental policy at both the state and federal levels. Now, none of this work could be done alone, and we rely on a network of volunteers, donors, and members who assist us in a whole variety of different projects. If you're already a volunteer, a member, a supporter, or a past participant of the Backyard Winter Bird Survey, we thank you. We couldn't achieve any of our missions without you. So, the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. This is one of my favorite projects and one of our flagship participatory science projects that we have as an organization. And I want to know how much you already know about the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. So as I start to talk about some of its history, I invite you to put in the chat if you've participated before, how many years you've participated, or if this year is going to be your first time participating ever. So feel free to put those notes in the chat. It'll be exciting to see the variety of different people who are tuning in and their experiences. Oh, and I see right off the board, we have a first timer, 2 first timers. I'm so excited. As you put that in the chat, I'll tell you a little bit more about the project. The Backyard Winter Bird Survey is really designed to be a fun and easy project. We simply ask that participants count the birds in their backyards over the survey weekend, which this year is February 8th and 9th, and report what they are seeing to us. There's a little more detail, but that is really the crux of it. And thanks to volunteers like you, we are able to collect a huge amount of data to understand winter bird trends. The Backyard Winter Bird Survey actually started way back in the 1960s as a cardinal and tufted titmouse survey. Believe it or not, these two species were fairly rare in the state at the time, and New Hampshire Audubon biologists wanted a way to crowdsource data to understand the distribution of cardinals and tufted titmice. The survey started on paper data sheets that were mailed out to participants. You have to remember that for this time period, this was pretty revolutionary. There was no widely available internet, and getting data on this scale was truly remarkable. In 1987, the survey expanded to its current form, collecting data on all backyard birds, and it has remained so since then. It is held every year on the second weekend in February, and with over 35 years of data, it represents one of the largest systematic data sets for understanding winter bird trends here in New Hampshire. So, what will you learn tonight? In this webinar, you will learn how to participate in the upcoming survey. You'll also learn tips for identifying common backyard birds. You'll get some advice for using our new online survey form. With your help, we're hoping that this innovation will help us process your data faster. And finally, we'll take a look at the data and examine what it has to tell us about bird population trends in New Hampshire. Just to give you some perspective, last year we had over 1,500 participants, and we're hoping that you will help us grow that number. As I like to say, make your backyard birds count. A lovely element of the survey is its local nature. The birds that you see every day are the birds that end up in our final tally, and are the ones that tell us what is happening with bird populations across the state. I don't know about you, but I take a sense of pride out of knowing that my backyard birds are the ones contributing to a real scientific effort. We have participants from all across the state, as you'll see in the map. The greens and yellows indicate our highest number of observers by county. We have the most participants in the southern part of the state and at the seacoast, with less as you move further north in the state, as you'd expect. If you live up in Coos County, take this as yet another sign to join in the survey this year. But really, we're excited to have participants from all across the state, no matter where you live in New Hampshire. Okay, as we get started and talking more about the survey, I first just want to share some of the most common backyard winter birds we had on last year's survey. But to make it a little bit more fun, I invite you to take a guess on what the most common backyard bird was last year. Feel free to put in the chat what bird you think it might be, and we'll see if your guess is right. Okay, I'm seeing some guesses. We have chickadees, blue jays, junco, titmouse. Okay, I see that one person already has the correct bird in the chat, which is awesome. I see some more guesses, starlings, more chickadees. There's a lot of chickadees. Sparrow, junco. Nice. Okay. Well, I'll reveal the results, but I'm not going to tell you the highest count yet. I'll start with the top 5, moving from 5 to 1. So our 5th highest bird last year was the blue jay. We had about 4,373 reported on the survey. And our 4th highest was black-capped chickadees. I see that many people guessed that in the chat. And that was pretty high as well. We had about 4,395. And that's a bird that is quite common at backyard feeders. Coming in at number 3 is mourning dove. And then number two, as quite a few people are guessing in the chat, we have dark-eyed juncos coming in at 9,665 individuals. And then I think there was only one person in the chat who guessed goldfinch, but you are totally correct. The highest count last year was for American goldfinch, just under 10,000 individual birds counted. So another lovely thing about the survey is its accessibility. It's a great thing to do with the whole family. And what I like to say is you are welcome to stand outside and count birds if you'd like, but you're also welcome to be more of an indoor cat if you're like me. I recommend sitting in a comfy chair by the window and watching the birds that way. I mentioned that the survey is over a weekend, so February 8th and 9th. You can watch 24/7 for the 2 days if you want, but you can also watch for just 15 minutes on one of those days. Either way, your data is incredibly valuable to us. In order to maintain a level of data standardization, we ask that you only report the birds you see on the 2 survey dates. It is always the case that a favorite bird hangs around all week leading up to the survey and then disappears just when it comes time for the survey. Nonetheless, we ask that you only report the birds seen on these 2 days. This just helps us standardize the data and really get a snapshot of what's happening on this weekend. Also, I just want to note that if you are one of the few very unlucky people who doesn't see any birds on that weekend, please, please, please still fill out a form. Having no birds in your backyard is still very valuable data to us. Okay, now let's talk about counting the actual birds. When you're recording your observations, whether online or on a paper form, you'll be asked to report the species you see and the number of individuals of each. Counting birds may seem straightforward, but there are a few important guidelines to follow. For this survey, we ask that you report the maximum number of a species seen at one time to prevent double counting. Anyone who has watched a busy bird feeder knows how chaotic it can be. Birds darting in, grabbing food, and flying off to eat elsewhere. You might wonder, is this the same chickadee that just flew off, or is it a new one? To ensure accuracy in tracking population trends, the survey's methodology relies on recording the highest number of individuals of a species seen simultaneously or all at once, rather than adding up every bird that appears throughout the day. An example of this is if you see 3 chickadees at 10 a.m., and then you look outside at 11 a.m. and see just 1 chickadee, you should report 3, as that was the highest number seen together at one time. This method prevents overestimation, as the single chickadee seen later in the day could be one of the original 3. By following this approach, we can collect reliable data that helps us monitor bird populations over time. Another thing about the survey that might surprise you is that any bird you can reasonably see from your house counts. You might be surprised that you do not need a bird feeder to participate in the survey. You can simply count the birds in the bushes next to your house. Birds flying over your house are also fair game. And if you are lucky enough to live on Great Bay or next to a river, as long as you can see birds in those places from your backyard, they count too. You might also be surprised that the survey is not just about birds. We also encourage people to count the squirrels in their backyards, and new this year, the chipmunks as well. I love this photo. This photo is from Alan on his 2024 Backyard Winter Bird Survey last year. This is a rare genetic expression of a black squirrel. It's actually a gray squirrel, but it has a weird genetic thing where its pigment is showing up as black. So you never know what kind of exciting things you're going to see on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. They might even be squirrels, not birds. We ask that folks only report the birds that they can confidently identify. This helps to ensure the quality of our data The good news is that there are lots of resources available out there to help you identify your backyard birds. So do not worry if you're not a professional birder yet. On our webpage, we've created a quick guide to the 30 birds that are commonly reported on this survey. I encourage you to check it out. It has great quick notes to help with bird ID questions and was specifically made with this survey in mind for New Hampshire. We also have a guide to commonly confused birds on our webpage as well. This is a guide for those species that are a little more tricky and we often see misidentified. And then beyond that, there are also many free digital resources available to help you with bird ID. One of my favorites is the Merlin Bird ID app. This is free to download in the App Store. You can put in your location and date, and it will give you a list of expected species and tips for bird ID. And then if you were still stumped, you can always shoot us an email with a photo, and one of our talented team of volunteers can try our best to help you identify the bird in your backyard. And I just want to plug here that even a quote unquote bad photo can still be very useful. Feel free to put in the chat any guesses what this bird might be in this photograph by Lindsay. Okay, I see some nice guesses. A hawk, an owl. Yeah, so Jen, you got it. Um, so from looking at this photo, it might look like a very blurry blob. But for our volunteers, when they're looking at this, they're seeing the barring on the back of this bird. They're seeing that the photograph was taken at night. They're looking at the size of this bird relative to the trees. And just using those clues, they would be able to confidently identify this as a barred owl, as this photo shows here. So I would just encourage you that if you really can't identify a bird, you've looked at the resources and you're still stumped, take a photo, even if it's a bad photo, and just send it in with your survey. And we can try to help you identify that bird. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, it's okay if you're not an expert birder. We are all learning together, and in that spirit, I thought I'd share a few tips that helped me when I started to learn to identify birds. My first tip is to learn the usual suspects. The great thing is that in winter, there are less species around. So if you learn the top 20 or so, you will know most of the birds you will see in your backyard. And many of them are quite distinct, like this black-capped chickadee. You might be surprised by how many different species you already know how to identify. Looking at that guide to common winter birds on our webpage can be a great way to learn the usual suspects. The second tip that I have is to think about the size of the bird you're trying to identify. Cornell Lab of Ornithology uses this nice range. Think about whether the bird is the size of a sparrow, a robin, or a goose. This sounds simple, but you would be surprised by how quickly it can help you narrow your possibilities down to a few species. I also like to think a lot about bill shape. Is the bill really long and pointy, indicating a woodpecker perhaps? Or is it short and fat, stubby, like the bill of a finch? Thinking about these general patterns can help you look at a list of possible species and narrow it down to just a few. My third piece of advice is to not get overwhelmed immediately with narrowing an individual down to what species is it. First, think about what bird group the bird might belong to. Is it a small brown bird? Great. You've already narrowed it down to sparrows. And then you can look at your bird guide or one of our free digital guides for what sparrow species it might be and clue in a little bit more to some of the visual details on the bird. But if you've thought about the group first, you don't have to look at all the bird possibilities. You can just look at a few of them. And this can help to avoid some of the anxiety you might feel when starting to identify birds. Breaking ID down into pieces can help a lot with that. Another thing I like to remind people is that males and females of the same species can look very different. Almost everyone knows the bright red of a male cardinal, but don't forget that birds like this are also cardinals, just the female ones. It's also important to remember that a bird's winter plumage can look very different to its summer. You might be used to the very bright male American goldfinches of the summer, but in the winter, remember that they have a far duller and less dramatic plumage. And now onto my favorite topic, the commonly confused birds. There are several cases where we often see confusion on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. And to help address this, we have created a guide to commonly confused species on our webpage. I encourage you to check it out. Speaking of commonly confused species, what are these two birds? Feel free to put your answer in the chat with the species and the number on the slide. So you can put in the chat the species with a 1 next to it for what you think bird number 1 is, and the species with a 2 next to it for what you think number 2 is. Okay, I'm seeing some guesses. Downy first, hairy second. Nice. Okay, you guys are awesome. So I see that many people have gotten this one, which is a great sign. Number 1 is a downy woodpecker, and number 2 is a hairy woodpecker. These birds are very similar in appearance. Both of the photographed ones are males with a red patch on the back of the head. Females lack this red patch. Now, the downy woodpecker is smaller than the hairy woodpecker, but that can be hard if they're not side by side, and they almost never cooperate in the wild and appear side by side for this kind of comparison. What I like to do is look at the bill and its length relative to the head of the bird. On the downy, the bill is very short, relatively speaking, and is definitely shorter than the length of that bird's head. While on the hairy, the bill is about the same length as the head. So there are other ways to tell the difference between these two species, but that's just one way to look at it. And it's just a good reminder that just taking a careful look at proportions or other key field marks can really help you begin to confidently tell the difference between two species that look similar. Okay, on a more challenging note, each year we have multiple reports of red-headed woodpeckers. These 3 birds on this slide all have quote unquote red heads, but only one is a red-headed woodpecker. The bird on the far left is a red-headed woodpecker. This species is actually extremely rare in the state, with only a few verified reports each year. Often when we see notes about a quote unquote red-headed woodpecker, it is actually one of the other 2 species, a pileated woodpecker or a red-bellied woodpecker. Pileated woodpeckers are the largest woodpecker species. They have a bright red crest and distinct white and black on the face. These are the huge woodpeckers you see in your backyard. Then there are the red-bellied woodpeckers, which despite their name often lack a red belly. This one in the photo is a female. It has red on the nape or back of the neck, but not over the top of the whole head, reaching towards the bill. In a male, the red band would continue to the base of the bill tip. Their checkerboard black and white back is a key identifying feature. So remember that just because you have a red head doesn't mean you're a red-headed woodpecker. Okay, and now we have the perennial favorite. Feel free to throw in the chat what you think these 2 birds are. Remember to put the number next to the bird species. Okay, nice. I'm seeing some good answers. This is great. So if you guessed one as a male house finch and two as a male purple finch, you are already an amazing birder. These two finches trip up the best of us. The purple finch is actually the state bird, yet for most of New Hampshire, house finch are more common than purple finch. Here's some advice for telling them apart. Male house finches are fire engine red on the head, breast, and rump. However, they have brown on much of their back. Male purple finches, as I like to say, appear that they've been dipped in raspberry juice. House finches have a mostly squared off tail, while purple finches, as you can tell in this photo, have a deeply V-notched tail with a purple color on the head and back. They also have less streaking on the back than the house finch. Purple finches are more common than house finches north of the White Mountains in the state, while house finches are more common south. So if you live in central or southern New Hampshire, I just encourage you to check your finches carefully, as both species can be found in southern and central New Hampshire. It's not just the males that are hard to tell apart. The females can be too. But if you look closely, you'll see that the female house finch is all brown, while female purple finches on the face have a white stripe above the eye. And this white stripe can really be indicative and help you identify a female purple finch. I think I said house finch, but the white stripe above the eye is the female purple finch. And the house finch has no white stripe and an all brown head. And on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey, if you don't know what species a bird is, you can always report the category of the bird. Great examples of these include reporting hawk species or sparrow species. And I just want to note that comments are always welcome. If you are unsure about a species, comments can help me and my team of volunteers work out what species you saw. They're also helpful for documenting any unusual birds that you see if you couldn't get a photo of it. From this comment about the dark-eyed junco, I can tell exactly what bird species it is. This comment reads, feeding on the ground, which is a key behavior of this species, pink conical bill, gray on the head and back, with a white belly. So you can see that the note focuses on behavior and key field markings. Unfortunately, comments like, I saw it, or I used Merlin to identify it, don't help our biologists confirm the presence of a rare bird. So what I'd ask here is just that you add some detail to your comments and make sure that they're really describing key field markings so that someone who looks at them could tell exactly what bird you saw. This is especially helpful in the cases of rare species where we require documentation to confirm the sighting. So you've watched the birds in your backyard over the survey weekend, February 8th and 9th, and now you're ready to share what you saw. Online, we have an easy-to-use reporting form. You can find it on our website, linked, and is also linked here. And I think Zoe will put it in the chat for you. I will note that there is a button to press on our webpage for the survey link. It's not live yet, and that was done intentionally so that we make sure that the data is submitted after the survey weekend has happened or while it's happening. As any data submitted before would just be speculation on what you might see. So revisit that webpage during the survey weekend and it will be live and you'll be able to submit your data right there. It's set up very simply. It's a Google form and we start off by asking questions about where you watched for birds, which days you watched, the Saturday, the Sunday, or both days perhaps. I do recognize that the Sunday is the Super Bowl, but you are always welcome to just watch on the Saturday or to add a new dimension to your Super Bowl watching and maybe peer out your window for 15 minutes during a commercial break. We also ask questions about how long you watched. That's getting at the effort, whether it's 15 minutes or 3 hours, and how we can get in touch with you if we have any questions about the birds you saw on your survey. One of my pieces of advice is to either take a scrap piece of paper or to print out one of our paper data sheets to help you while you're watching the birds. And you can make notes about the species you saw in the counts. And then to go online at the end of your counting time and upload your data or enter your data into our form. And that can help you keep track of the birds in a very nice, kind of tangible paper way, and then submit your data to us to help us process the results faster and make sure we get an accurate account. Then we move on to the fun part of the form. We have a list of the most common birds where you can simply put in the counts for the weekend. Sometimes you might see a bird that isn't listed in our 30 most common species, and if this is the case, there's also space for the write-in species. You can type in the name of the species that you saw and add the count for the species. And that's it. The form is pretty simple, but we're hoping that it'll help us process your data faster. Okay. Now, what happens to that data once it's submitted? Well, first it goes through a lengthy quality control process and a lot of work to ensure that we have all our data together in one place. But after that is complete, it is used to look at population trends over time. With 37 years of data and counting, the Backyard Winter Bird Survey has a lot to tell us about winter birds in New Hampshire. I'm going to walk you through a few of those trends tonight, but I encourage you to check out our webpage to learn even more. To make it a little more interesting, I will first show you the photo of the species that we're going to talk about and invite you to guess what species it is before I show you the trend. You can guess by putting those species in the chat. Okay, so what's this bird? Feel free to take a guess and drop your answer in the chat. Okay, everyone who's submitted one so far is getting bluebird, which is awesome. You guys are already great birders. So yes, you're correct. This is an eastern bluebird. It is a beloved backyard bird for obvious reasons. But let's take a look at the graph a little bit closer, showing the data for this species on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. As you orient yourself to this graph, you'll notice the y-axis or the vertical axis represents bluebirds per observer. This standardization accounts for variations in the number of participants each year. So we standardize the data by looking at bluebirds per observer. This can help make the trends more comparable over time. When the survey first began, almost no bluebirds remained in New Hampshire through February. They were traditionally actually considered a sign of spring. However, as the graph shows, this has changed dramatically. Since the early 2000s, wintering eastern bluebirds have become increasingly common in the state. Why is this happening? There are a few possible explanations, and the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. Warmer winters due to climate change may be making New Hampshire more hospitable for bluebirds year-round. There's also been changes in landscaping, which have provided more winter food sources. Bluebirds rely on fruit, and the widespread planting of ornamental fruit trees with persistent berries may have helped them overwinter successfully. These long-term data trends highlight how both climate and human activity can influence bird populations. Okay, what about this bird? Feel free to put your guess in the chat. Okay, this is awesome. You guys are spot on right again. That's so exciting. So this is an American robin. Similar to the eastern bluebird, robins were once considered a sign of spring again. However, they increased dramatically during the winter, and they are now found year-round, except in much of Coos County and the White Mountains. The same causes of this change for eastern bluebirds are thought to be driving this change in American robins. Exciting to see a bird that's increasing in New Hampshire during the winter. Okay, we had this bird a little earlier, so who knows what this one is? Feel free to put your guess in the chat. Awesome. Okay, if you guessed red-bellied woodpecker, you would be correct. Um, the name issues aside, the red-bellied woodpecker is a very recent colonist to New Hampshire. It was quite rare, as you can see in the graph, prior to the 2000s, but since then has expanded rapidly across the state, south of the White Mountains. The reasons for the northward expansion aren't well understood, but tend to consider factors including reforestation, increases in feeders, and climate change. It's also been proposed that the loss of elms to Dutch elm disease from the 1940s onward helped this species by providing more dead trees for nest sites. Red-bellied woodpeckers are a species that is range expanding. So their range has shifted northward into New Hampshire over the last 2 decades. Okay, what is this bird? This is a bird that I've had quite a few calls about this winter, and I'm expecting to see quite a few show up on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey in February. Okay, you guys are awesome. I'm seeing quite a few guesses for Carolina Wren. So this is a Carolina Wren. It's one of the more recent southern invaders to expand into New Hampshire. You can see this gradual process in the graph. This is a wren that has a lot of personality. It makes a lot of noise. And once you have them, you won't stop seeing it. It has this nice eye stripe above the eye, which can help you tell it apart from other wrens that you would see in your backyard. And Carolina wrens are staying throughout the winter here. Throughout their gradual colonization of New England, these wrens have occasionally faced high mortality during unusually cold winters, presumably a consequence of their southern origins. But the wrens who survive are just a little hardier, and slowly but surely the species has adapted to the local climate. While the local climate also becomes more favorable, bird feeders have also likely been an important part of this expansion, since a reliable food source can ensure survival over cold winter nights. A nearby shed or space beneath a porch can also provide critical shelter against the elements for this bird. Okay, I'm not going to bother with guesses for this bird. I think everyone can guess the wild turkey. Wild turkeys are often found around the bottom of bird feeders, and while you might not think of them as a breeder bird, I think they count. Um, you might be surprised, however, to know that turkeys were locally extinct in New Hampshire due to overhunting prior to the 1960s. So before 1960s, if you were in New Hampshire, there weren't any turkeys, which is crazy when you look out your window today and you see turkeys everywhere. In 1969, New Hampshire Fish and Game began releasing turkeys in the southern part of the state, starting around Pawtuckaway State Park. This early restoration attempt failed due to harsh winters, but a second series of releases beginning in 1975 was clearly successful, and our data shows that as well. With all near zero turkeys at the beginning of the survey to almost 2 per observer on every backyard winter bird count. Although the growth was initially slow, the population took off in the 1990s, and turkeys have now been found in every single town in New Hampshire, counter to early predictions that they wouldn't get north of the Lakes region. You'll also see that in last year's survey, the turkey numbers were down. You can see that in the last dot on the far right of the graph. Unfortunately, the prior summer was very wet, and the chicks, which are susceptible to cold and persistent rain, can unfortunately die of exposure, which led to a poor recruitment in the turkey population. A similar pattern was seen in New Hampshire Fish and Game's summer brood summary data, another participatory science project where people report what they're seeing with birds in their backyard. but this time just for wild turkeys in the summer. Okay, what about this bird? Feel free to put your guess in the chat. It's okay if you don't guess this one. This one is a hard one. Not many people south of the Whites see it today, but 40 years ago, you could have had almost 20 at your feeder at once. So this bird is an evening grosbeak. You'll see that when the survey started, there were many seen on the survey. That number has dropped dramatically. The evening grosbeak's heyday in the Northeast and in New Hampshire, which lasted roughly from 1950 to the 1990s, coincided with a large outbreak of spruce budworm, which is a moth in eastern Canada. As this outbreak started to wind down, the grosbeaks lost an abundant source of food and their population declined. The budworm operates on roughly a 40-year cycle. And in the early 2000s, a new outbreak started in southern Quebec. Shortly after that, the number of grosbeaks visiting New Hampshire started to grow again. You can see the early signs of that in this graph. And while we're still a long way from those numbers during the last outbreak, there are signs that there are more grosbeaks to come. Remember that the peaks for this species typically occur every other year. So there are still winters where grosbeaks will be extremely hard to find, and it remains to be seen whether the species will recover to its previous numbers. There's a whole research group called the Finch Network that is looking into the causes of the decline of the evening grosbeak, which has declined by about 92%.
Okay, so
Okay.
I have a quick question about the graphs. Someone is asking if you can call attention to the varying scales on the vertical axis of the graphs.
Oh, great question. So let's go back to the evening grosbeak. So we see on this one, it ranges from 0 to 8. And on the last one, I think it was a smaller number than that. And that's really just varying based on how many birds were actually seen per observer. So for some species, you may see as maybe on average, you see 3 per observer, but in other species, the y-axis is going to be smaller because you see a smaller number on each survey. That's a great question. So I'm going to share this bird as well, and we'll take a look at its graph and look at that axis. But does anyone know what this species is? Oh, and you guys are right on. This is a house finch. Yes. So we see here on the graph, instead of 0 to 8, we have a 1 to 2 to 3. And this is because typically people are seeing lower counts of house finches at their feeders. So it's just representing that range of different numbers of a species that people are seeing on their backyard winter bird survey count. And because it's standardized, you can sometimes get weird numbers like 0.5. We're not saying that anyone is seeing 0.5 of a bird, but we're saying that on average, we could have 2 survey participants and one of them is seeing that species and one of them is not. It's just a funky quirk of the standardization. So this is the house finch, and you might be surprised to know that all the house finches we see in New Hampshire are actually the descendants of a handful of birds that were released on Long Island in the 1940s. You'll notice a really steep increase in the data, and then a really steep decline. The rapid rise of the house finch population in the East was curtailed by the emergence of a conjunctivitis strain that caused considerable mortality. The numbers dropped quickly to much lower levels where they remain today. The bird's high vulnerability to disease was likely due to its low genetic diversity, with all of those birds coming from a handful of finches that were released on Long Island. They had a very low genetic diversity to begin with, which made them more susceptible to disease. Conjunctivitis is still present in New Hampshire finches. So if you see birds at your feeders that are lethargic or have crusty or swollen eyes, you should take your feeders in, clean them thoroughly, and wait 2 weeks before putting them back outside This can help minimize the risk of transmitting disease to other birds. Okay, and what about this bird? This one's a little bit harder. So this bird is a redpoll. Redpolls are known as classic winter birds that fluctuate a lot in population. You can see in this graph that sometimes there are a lot of them and sometimes there are none. And it goes back and forth every year. The peaks are called eruptions on this graph and result when bird food supplies in their regular winter range, which is up in Canada, are low, thus forcing them to move elsewhere in large numbers to search for better feeding grounds. For redpolls, the driver of these eruptions are spruce and birch seeds in boreal Canada, where the species nests. These trees typically produce bumper crops every other year, and in the off years, we expect the birds to show up much further south, such as in New Hampshire. Although this pattern is pretty consistent, there are obvious deviations, and the cause of these are not entirely known. But you'll see that since 2017, we haven't had huge eruptions of this species. So it's not surprising that a lot of folks haven't seen them in their backyard yet. And I will note that the species used to be known as the common redpoll. There were two species, the common redpoll and the hoary redpoll, and these two groups were recently combined into one species known as the redpoll. And that is a decision that was made by the global collaboration that determines bird names and what quantifies a bird species. And then there are times where we make unexpected discoveries. Last year, we had our first ever record of a yellow-throated warbler on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. This is a bird that lost its course and ended up in a lucky surveyor's backyard. Its typical winter range is in the Caribbean, Florida, and Mexico. This bird hung around in her backyard where she generously fed it for the entire winter. But you never know what you're going to find on the Backyard Winter Bird Survey. And that's part of what makes it fun. Each year, we also begin to understand exciting patterns in the data and see species that we haven't seen before on the survey. During the last survey weekend, we documented a record 12 pine warblers. This is a species that usually migrates south and spends the winter in states like Florida and Georgia. Yet, likely due to a mild winter, some individuals decided to stay here in New Hampshire. We've also observed changes like wintering turkey vultures and most recently black vultures, birds that typically didn't stay in New Hampshire for the winter, but now are staying in New Hampshire for the winter in ways that we didn't see in the past. And again, these are a few individuals, but it does highlight that there are at least conditions that are favorable for some individuals of these species that typically are migrating further south. And here's a quote from one of our senior biologists, Pam Hunt, to hopefully help to inspire you as you contribute your data. Her quote goes like this: "As a number of birds have been telling us for decades, our winters are getting warmer." I just want to encourage you that while participation in the survey may seem like a relatively small act, your participation really matters. This project would not be possible without volunteers like you. And in the light of climate change, along with habitat loss, diseases, and other threats, the data we collect during this weekend is all the more important. As Pam's quote alludes to, bird populations are a wonderful tool to track changes in temperature and climate and look at how birds will respond to these changes in the future. As we near the end of tonight's webinar, I just want to thank you. This survey would not be possible without the participation of all the many backyard birders over the survey weekend and the many donations that support the continuation of the program. Thank you. And So, last reminder, mark your calendar for February 8th and 9th and count your birds. Visit our webpage for details and data submission. All the photos come up here um, are from participants in the past surveys, participants just like you. Together, we can make a difference for New Hampshire's birds. Thank you for coming tonight. We'll share a recording of this webinar on our webpage. And with the time we have left, I'd love to open the floor to questions. Zoe, feel free to unmute. I will stop sharing my screen and we can look at what questions have been coming up in the Q&A and try to get to as many of them as possible.
Just to start, I have a great one that I answered already, but someone thinks they will be reporting some rare birds and they wanted to know if they could submit a photo to support their identification. So if anybody else has that question, you can email any photos to bwbs@nhaudubon.org with your name and address so that our naturalists can help identify that. Someone else asked if we will be asking male versus female on the survey, and you do not need to specify. Grace showed an example of it and it'll just have you fill in numbers. Some other questions. Tracy said she has the Merlin app and was wondering if they could submit birds by voice by the identification from the app.
Oh, this is a great question. So the answer is yes or no. Essentially, if the app identifies the bird for you, we ask that you confirm that it's right. We ask that you listen to the bird and you listen to the recording or the identification recording and you confirm whether the app is right. Because sometimes, while the app is a great tool, it does make mistakes. And for this survey, we're asking that you report the birds that you heard or saw. So if you are using the app to help with identification and to help you learn the birds, that's great. But if only the app picks up the bird, then we ask that you leave that off your survey unless you can confirm through finding the bird or hearing it yourself that that was the bird, indeed the species that you saw. So the answer is a little bit muddled, but really focusing on making sure that you see or hear the bird as well. And not just relying on Merlin's AI. But Merlin is a phenomenal tool and I definitely recommend checking it out. We just want to make sure that people are also confirming what Merlin is saying. And for those of you who are not familiar with what I was just talking about, Merlin does have a feature where it can listen to the birds around you and then suggest possible birds that it's hearing. And we just recommend that people always take a closer listen and make sure that it is actually indeed that species.
Another question, Bettina is asking how she can get access to the graphs to use in a math class. So maybe they could put their email in the chat and you guys can connect.
Oh yeah, that sounds great. We have a few of them on our webpage, but I would love to share them with you as well. And we could find a couple if you had a few favorites bird species, and I would love to share those. So feel free to put your email in the chat and I'll get back to you.
Someone else is asking, which is a helpful question, should spouses register separately or submit data separately or as one house?
Oh, this is a perfect question. So if you are watching birds in the same backyard, which I'm assuming you would, you can put both of your names on the form. Yeah.
But just submit one.
And just submit one form. Exactly.
Jen and George are wondering if a gray jay has ever been reported, if you know off the top of your head.
Yes, a few gray jays have been reported. If you would like to add to that total, I would love that. For those who are not familiar, gray jays are birds that are typically found on the top of mountaintops or in northern New Hampshire. And they are known for being very friendly and coming in to get food out of your hand. So yes, please add a gray jay to the Backyard Winter Bird Survey, but we have had some in the past.
Someone just asked if they observe for 2 hours and then a few hours later see a bird they had not seen yet, can they still count it?
As long as it is on the 8th or the 9th, definitely. And what I would do is just add you know, however much you watched for the second period to your initial amount of time. You can total birds. We just ask that you really take the strong assessment of making sure that you're only reporting the maximum number of each species.
Someone else asked if we share the data with any other organizations like Fish and Wildlife, US Fish and Wildlife Services, etc.
Oh, that's a great question. So at New Hampshire Audubon, we work closely with partners, including very closely with our partners at New Hampshire Fish and Game. And we share our reports and summaries with them.
Someone is a beginner and is asking for food recommendations for certain regions.
Oh, I love this question. So I'm guessing food for the birds, not for you. But my favorite bird feeder food are the black oil sunflower seeds. There's the smaller ones. That will get you the greatest variety of birds. And I recommend putting those in a tube feeder. Um, Another recommendation that I would suggest is if you want to attract woodpeckers, I'd put up a little suet cage and put some suet in that cage as well. And that can help bring woodpeckers to your feeders as well. And
Um, oh,
go ahead.
do you have more for that?
I could talk about bird feed forever. So.
I'm gonna put your bird feeding article in the chat too. So
Oh, great. Exactly. I know. I was like, oh, I could tell you everything about feed and bird. But the sunflower seeds is the best place to start, the black oil sunflower seeds.
Somebody else asked, what if there's severe weather like a snowstorm during the survey days?
Severe weather like a snowstorm. The great thing about this data set is that it is so long. It's its longevity. So we've had lots of crazy weather events during the survey, and sometimes that can really influence what birds are coming to your feeder. But when we look at the data long term over many years, those kind of really unusual weather events and those days where bird conditions just weren't great, those all level out in the data. So don't be too worried about that. And then the other thing that I'd say is snowstorms actually quite often can drive the birds to your bird feeder as they have trouble finding food in their other sources, as everything is covered in snow, so they can't forage on the ground, for example. So you might be surprised if we have a big snowstorm, we might actually get more birds on the backyard winter bird survey.
This is a quick question. Josh asked if the recording will be available, and yes, we are hoping to get it on our website in a few days. So it'll be on that Backyard Winter Bird Survey page. Somebody else asked if they observe for both days, do they submit a form for each day or one form for both?
This is a great question. So you submit a form for the entire weekend. You'll see on the form that there is a box for you to check the days that you surveyed. So you would just check Saturday and Sunday, and you would combine your hours that you surveyed for both days, and then you would report the maximum number of each species that you saw over the whole weekend. Thank you so much for asking that question.
Someone is saying they live near the Bellamy Sanctuary, and they were wondering if they could do their observations there instead of their yard.
Oh, great question. We often have people who maybe live in a condo or apartment building and they can't really count birds there. So what we say to those folks is that you can often adopt a backyard if you want. Um, for that situation, you could consider it adopting a backyard. I would really encourage you though to check out your own backyard. You might be surprised by the number of birds that are in your backyard.
And this might be a fun one to end on if there's no more logistical questions, but someone asked if you've heard story of overpopulation of barred owls.
Oh, I think that's more of a question for our audiences out west. Here in New Hampshire, we have a lot of barred owls. That's true. But I don't really see that as a problem. People often do get upset about predators, whether they're at their bird feeder. It can be distressing to see a hawk or an owl um, go for your smaller birds at your feeder, but I just want to encourage people that every bird counts and they're all part of the food chain. So yeah, thinking a little bit more about predators being valuable as well. And I encourage you, if you see a barred owl on the backyard winter bird survey, please let us know. We would love to hear about it. And that species definitely counts. And the other thing I'll add is that it was a really good summer for barred owl production in New Hampshire. Um, so while there are a lot more out there, I wouldn't really consider it overpopulation, just that they had a really good year. And there are always ups and downs in that bird population over time.
And then there's one more that I actually missed. Zinta asked if there is a minimum amount of time you would like us to observe per day.
Oh, nice. So I think what I would say is that you can observe for as little or as long as you like. I think 15 minutes is a good minimum. So if you can observe 15 minutes, even if it's just 15 minutes on the Saturday, that is still really valuable data.
No, I think that's it, unless anyone wants to add anything else.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for turning out tonight. It was great to spend the evening with you, and I hope that this webinar encourages you to participate this year. We would love to hear what's happening in your backyards all across New Hampshire. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Um, we can put the email for this project in the chat. But yeah, stay in touch, submit your data on the survey weekend, and as always, enjoy watching the birds in your backyard. Thank you so much.
I had one more last minute question that's good. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Let's
Um,
see.
what should someone do if they see a bird they're unsure of?
If you see a bird you're unsure of, check out one of our digital guides to see if it can help you identify it. And if you're still unsure, you can shoot us an email. That email address is also on our webpage, and just send us a photo and we can help you identify it. You can always make a note on your survey form submission in the comment section that you have emailed us a photo, and that can help us make sure that we need to look for that photo. Great. Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to see what you see in your backyards this February.